The coffee in her mug had gone cold 2 hours ago, but Captain Lyra Kavanagh hadn't noticed. She sat alone in the corner of the Camp Pendleton mess hall, civilian clothes hanging loose on her frame, blonde hair tied back in a simple ponytail that brushed her shoulders. The din of morning chatter surrounded her like white noise, Marines and sailors moving through their routines with the easy camaraderie of people who belonged. She didn't look like she belonged. That was intentional. In 72 hours, she would take command of SEAL Team 7's aviation detachment, the first woman to do so in the unit's history. But today, in faded jeans and a university sweatshirt, she was just another face in the crowd, observing, learning, gathering intelligence the way she'd been trained. The way that had kept her alive through 4 combat deployments and earned her a Silver Star nobody here knew existed. She was reaching for her tray when she felt it, the sharp tug on her ponytail, hard enough to jolt her head backward. Laughter erupted behind her, the kind of rough masculine amusement that echoed through military spaces everywhere. "Blondie's got nice hair," a voice drawled, thick with Carolina accent. "Probably spends all day on it instead of doing real work." More laughter. Lyra's hand paused halfway to her tray, every muscle in her body going still in that particular way that preceded violence. She'd killed men for less in Ramadi. But this wasn't Ramadi, and the Marine behind her was about to learn a lesson that would redefine his understanding of the chain of command. She turned slowly, her face a mask of polite confusion, and looked up at the Marine towering over her. He was massive, easily 6'4", with the build of someone who lived in the weight room. His name tape read Cordell, and the crossed rifles on his collar marked him as infantry. His friends flanked him, 5 more Marines with the cocky energy of men who'd never been told no. They were all staring at her with varying degrees of amusement, waiting for her reaction, expecting fear or anger or embarrassment. What they got instead was silence. Lyra held Cordell's gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to make him uncomfortable without him understanding why, then turned back to her tray and stood. She picked it up with deliberate calm and walked toward the exit, her footsteps measured and unhurried. Behind her, Cordell's voice rose again, playing to his audience. "That's right, walk away. Probably some contractor's girlfriend anyway." His friends laughed harder. None of them noticed the senior chief at the corner table who'd gone completely still, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips, his face draining of color as he recognized the woman walking past. The door swung shut behind Lyra, closing off the laughter and leaving her alone in the California morning. She stood for a moment in the pale sunlight, breathing slowly through her nose, feeling the familiar weight of command settling back onto her shoulders like an old flight suit. In 72 hours, none of this would matter. In 72 hours, Cordell would understand exactly who he'd touched. But right now, in this moment before the storm, Lyra allowed herself a small smile. She'd faced down insurgents in Fallujah, flown night raids over Helmand Province, and pulled 3 wounded SEALs out of a crashed helicopter under direct fire. A Marine with more muscles than sense was barely worth nodding. She walked across the compound toward the operations building, her pace easy and relaxed, giving no indication that anything had happened. But her mind was already working, cataloging details, filing away Cordell's face and name, and unit designation for future reference. Not for revenge. Lyra didn't operate that way, but because leaders needed to know their people, needed to understand the culture they were stepping into, needed to identify both threats and opportunities for growth. Cordell had just become a teaching moment waiting to happen. The ops building was quiet this early, most personnel still at breakfast or in morning physical training. Lyra used her newly issued credentials to access the SEAL spaces, moving through corridors that smelled of gun oil and salt water, and the particular staleness of buildings that housed men who spent most of their time deployed. The walls were covered with plaques and photographs, a visual history of the team stretching back decades. She paused at one particular image, a grainy shot from Desert Storm showing an earlier generation of warriors posed in front of their aircraft. The caption beneath identified them as members of the same detachment she was about to command. None of them were women. None of them looked like her. That was about to change. Her temporary office was at the end of the hall, a small room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a window overlooking the airfield. She'd been given 72 hours to review files, learn the organizational structure, and prepare for her assumption of command ceremony. 3 days to transform from anonymous observer to the officer responsible for 16 pilots, 32 aircrew, and 12 helicopters worth more than the GDP of some small nations. 3 days before she stood in front of those SEALs and told them she was their new commander, knowing that at least some of them would be thinking exactly what Cordell had been thinking in the mess hall. That she didn't belong, that she was a diversity hire, that she'd gotten the position because of politics rather than skill. Lyra had heard it all before, throughout her career, from flight school to her first operational squadron to every step up the rank structure. The whispers followed her like contrails, but whispers didn't matter. Results did. And Lyra's service record was a testament to results written in bullets and blood and the kind of flying that most pilots only dreamed about. She'd logged over 2,000 hours in combat zones, had more air medals than she could count, and had been personally requested by 3 different SEAL teams for close air support missions, because she had a reputation for getting her people home alive. None of which would matter if she couldn't win over her new command. Respect in the teams wasn't inherited or assumed. It was earned through demonstrated competence, through the willingness to suffer alongside your men, through the kind of leadership that made people want to follow you into hell because they trusted you to lead them back out. Lyra understood that calculus intimately. She'd been living it her entire career, fighting for every inch of credibility in a world that wasn't designed for women like her. She opened the first personnel file on her desk, beginning the deep dive into the lives and careers of the people she would soon lead. Each file told a story. Helicopter pilots who'd volunteered for the most dangerous missions in military aviation. Aircrew who jumped from perfectly good aircraft into hostile territory because SEALs needed support. Maintainers who kept aging helicopters flying through sheer determination and technical wizardry. These were the people who would either accept her or reject her, whose opinion would determine whether she succeeded or failed in the most important assignment of her career. The morning passed in a blur of personnel records and operational reports. Lyra absorbed information the way she always had, methodically and completely, building a mental database of names and faces and skills and weaknesses. She was halfway through the pilot roster when her door opened without warning. A man stepped inside, his khaki uniform immaculate, his face weathered by years of sun and salt spray. The trident on his chest marked him as a SEAL, and the rank insignia identified him as a Master Chief, the senior enlisted advisor for the detachment. Master Chief Riordan closed the door behind him and stood at attention. Captain Kavanagh. His voice was gravelly, the product of too many years shouting orders over rotor wash. Welcome to Team 7. There was something in his tone that made Lyra look up sharply from her files. Riordan's expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes held a mixture of concern and what might have been respect. Master Chief, Lyra stood, offering her hand. Riordan shook it firmly, his grip strong but not challenging. I wasn't expecting visitors until tomorrow's briefing. I know, ma'am. Riordan's jaw tightened slightly. But I just came from the mess hall, heard about an incident with some Marines from 2nd Battalion. He paused, watching her reaction. Figured you might want to know that Senior Chief Dalton witnessed the whole thing. He's spreading the word through the command about who those jarheads just disrespected. Lyra kept her expression calm, but internally she was reassessing her timeline. She'd hoped to have 3 more days of anonymity, 3 more days to observe without being observed. I appreciate the heads up, Master Chief, but it was nothing. A minor misunderstanding. With respect, ma'am, it wasn't nothing. Riordan's voice dropped lower, taking on the tone of a senior enlisted advisor speaking truth to an officer who needed to hear it. Words already moving through the teams. Half the command knows what happened, and the other half will know by lunch. How you handle this will set the tone for your entire tenure here." He shifted his weight slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "The men need to see their commander won't tolerate that kind of disrespect. Not to you, not to the uniform, not to the position." Lyra studied Riordan for a long moment, weighing options and outcomes with the same tactical precision she applied to flight planning. He was right, of course. Leadership was about perception as much as reality, and letting the incident pass without consequence would signal weakness to a community that valued strength above almost everything else. But responding too aggressively would make her look insecure, would confirm the suspicion that she'd been given the position as a political gesture and needed protection to maintain it. The door opened again before she could respond, and a lieutenant commander stepped inside. He was younger than Lyra expected, maybe 35, with the lean build of a runner and eyes that held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much combat. His name tape read Vance, and his wings identified him as a helicopter pilot. "Captain." He nodded curtly, ignoring Riordan's presence. "I'm your deputy commander, just heard about the mess hall. We need to address it immediately before it becomes a thing." "It's already a thing, sir," Riordan interjected, his voice flat. "Question is what kind of thing it becomes." The tension between the two men was palpable, the product of disagreements that predated Lyra's arrival. She made a mental note to explore that dynamic later, but right now she needed to establish control of the situation before it spiraled beyond her ability to shape the narrative. "Gentlemen," Lyra's voice cut through the building argument with the kind of command presence that came from years of talking pilots through crisis situations. "I appreciate your concern, but I'll handle this my way. Master Chief, I need you to find out everything you can about Marine Corporal Cordell. Assignment, background, chain of command. Commander Vance, I need the assumption of command ceremony moved up. We're doing it tomorrow morning instead of Thursday." Both men started to protest, but Lyra raised a hand, silencing them. "This isn't up for debate. If word is spreading through the command, then we control the narrative by accelerating our timeline. I take command tomorrow at 0800. The ceremony will be mandatory attendance for all assigned personnel. The entire SEAL community on base is invited, and I want 2nd Battalion's leadership in the front row." She paused, letting the implications sink in. Cordell and his friends are going to learn exactly who they disrespected, and they're going to learn it in front of everyone who matters. Riordan's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile Lyra had seen. "Aye, ma'am, I'll make the arrangements." He headed for the door, moving with the purposeful energy of a senior chief who'd just been given a mission he believed in. Vance remained behind, his expression skeptical. "With respect, Captain, you're making this personal. Bad precedent for a new commander." His tone was careful, walking the line between advice and insubordination. "We should focus on the mission, not on some jarhead stupidity." Lyra turned to face her deputy fully, taking his measure with the same analytical precision she'd applied to enemy positions in Iraq. Vance was smart, competent, and probably resentful that he'd been passed over for command in favor of an outsider. An outsider who happened to be a woman. She could work with resentment. What she couldn't tolerate was a deputy who undermined her decisions before she'd even assumed command. "Commander, let me be clear about something." Lyra's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath the words. "This isn't personal. This is about establishing that this detachment operates at a standard that doesn't tolerate disrespect to anyone wearing the uniform, regardless of rank or gender or position. Those Marines didn't just disrespect me. They disrespected every woman serving in this command, and they did it because they assumed I was nobody important. Tomorrow, they learn that assumption has consequences, and everyone else learns that I protect my people, all of them, from that kind of behavior." She moved closer, closing the distance until she was looking up at Vance from uncomfortably close range, violating his personal space the way good commanders sometimes had to do to make a point. "You want to question my decisions, that's fine. You want to provide contrary advice, I expect it. But you do it in private, not in front of the senior enlisted advisor, and you don't second-guess orders I've already given. Are we clear?" Vance held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Crystal clear, ma'am." There was something new in his expression now, a reassessment happening behind his eyes. "I'll coordinate with the protocol office on the accelerated ceremony." He turned and left without another word, leaving Lyra alone in her office with the afternoon sun streaming through the window. She returned to her desk, but the personnel files held less interest now. The incident in the mess hall had forced her hand, accelerated a timeline she'd carefully constructed, and turned what should have been a routine assumption of command into something else entirely. A statement, a line in the sand. The first battle in a war she'd been fighting her entire career, the war to prove that competence and courage weren't gender-specific traits. The afternoon dissolved into a flurry of preparation. Lyra reviewed her speech, coordinated with the protocol officer, and made courtesy calls to the SEAL team commander and the Marine battalion commander, whose subordinate had triggered this entire situation. Each conversation required careful navigation, balancing respect for the chain of command with the need to assert her authority as the incoming commander. By the time the sun set over the Pacific, painting the California coast in shades of orange and gold, everything was in place for tomorrow's ceremony. Lyra stood at her window, watching helicopters conduct evening flight operations on the airfield below. MH-60 Seahawks mostly, with a couple of MH-47 Chinooks mixed in, their rotors cutting through the twilight like mechanical dragonflies. She'd flown aircraft like those in some of the most hostile airspace on Earth, had pushed them to their limits and beyond, had learned to think like the machine and feel the air through the controls with an intuition that couldn't be taught. Flying was the one place where gender didn't matter, where skill and nerve were the only currencies that counted. In the sky, Lyra had always been respected. On the ground, she'd always had to fight for it. Tomorrow would be another fight, not with weapons or tactics, but with words and presence and the intangible force of command authority. She would stand in front of her new detachment and their SEAL customers and the Marine leadership and everyone else who mattered. And she would claim her position not as a diversity initiative or a political statement, but as a warrior who'd earned her place through blood and skill, and the kind of courage that didn't need an audience to exist. And Corporal Cordell would be there to witness it, to understand in vivid and uncomfortable detail exactly what he'd done in that mess hall. Not because Lyra needed revenge, but because teaching moments came in many forms, and sometimes the best lessons were the ones that burned themselves into memory through sheer force of humiliation. She turned away from the window as full darkness settled over the base. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing with it challenges and opportunities in equal measure. Tonight, she needed rest and preparation, and the mental clarity that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she was capable of accomplishing. Captain Lyra Kavanagh, naval aviator, combat veteran, and soon-to-be commander of one of the most elite aviation detachments in the United States military. A woman who'd been underestimated her entire career and had made a habit of proving every doubter wrong. The mess hall incident was just another chapter in a long story, and like every chapter before it, this one would end with Lyra still standing, still fighting, still proving that the sky belonged to anyone brave enough to claim it. The morning of the ceremony arrived with fog rolling in from the ocean, wrapping Camp Pendleton in gray cotton that muffled sound and reduced visibility to a few hundred yards. Lyra stood in her quarters, adjusting her service dress uniform with practiced precision. The dark blue jacket with its gold buttons and ribbons told the story of her career in miniature. Silver Star for valor in Ramadi. Bronze Star with V device for heroism in Afghanistan. Purple Heart from the helicopter crash that should have killed her but didn't. Air Medal with Valor device, again and again, one for each combat mission that had exceeded normal expectations of courage. Distinguished Flying Cross. And beneath them all, the wings that marked her as a naval aviator, the symbol that meant more to her than any medal or rank insignia. She studied herself in the mirror, seeing not just the officer she'd become, but the journey that had led here. The girl from Montana who dreamed of flying while watching crop dusters work her father's fields. The Annapolis midshipman who'd been told women weren't suited for combat aviation. The flight school student who'd outperformed 90% of her classmates and still had to prove herself every single day. The combat pilot who'd flown missions that would make hardened SEALs nervous. All of it, every experience and triumph and failure and hard-won lesson, had led to this moment. A knock on her door interrupted her reflection. Master Chief Riordan stood outside, his own dress uniform immaculate, his face betraying no emotion. "Time, ma'am. The ceremony begins in 15 minutes. Everyone's assembled, including your special guests." The slight emphasis on the last two words told Lyra everything she needed to know. Cordell and his Marine friends were present, probably confused about why they'd been ordered to attend a SEAL aviation change of command ceremony. "Outstanding, Master Chief. Let's go make some history." Lyra picked up her cover and followed Riordan out into the fog. They walked across the compound in silence, their footsteps echoing off unseen buildings, the whole world reduced to shapes and shadows in the thick marine layer. But as they approached the parade ground where the ceremony would take place, the fog began to thin, burned off by rising sun and California heat, revealing the assembled crowd in stages like a curtain slowly rising on a stage. There were more people than Lyra had expected. The entire SEAL Team 7 detachment stood in formation, 20 rows of warriors in their service dress uniforms, tridents gleaming on their chests. Behind them, other SEAL personnel from teams based at Coronado and Pendleton, drawn by word of mouth and curiosity about the first female detachment commander. To one side, the Marine leadership from 2nd Battalion, their expressions carefully neutral but their posture stiff with the awareness that they were present for a specific reason. And in the front row of the observers, 5 Marines in their dress blues, Cordell towering over the others, his face already showing the first signs of confused apprehension. The base commander stood at the podium, a Navy captain with gray hair and 3 decades of service behind him. He caught Lyra's eye as she approached and gave a slight nod of approval. The protocol officer guided her to her position beside the current detachment commander, a lieutenant commander named Harris who'd been serving in an acting capacity since the previous commander rotated out 6 weeks ago. Harris offered his hand, his grip firm and his smile genuine. "Hell of a way to start your tenure, ma'am. The whole base is talking about this." "Sometimes you don't get to choose your opening move, Commander. You just have to play the hand you're dealt." Lyra took her position and faced the assembled crowd as the protocol officer called the ceremony to order. The familiar ritual of military change of command began, orders read aloud, speeches given, tradition honored in the way that connected this moment to centuries of naval history. The base commander spoke about continuity and excellence. Harris gave his farewell remarks, his voice thick with emotion as he reflected on 2 years leading men he'd come to respect deeply. Then it was Lyra's turn. She stepped to the podium, looking out over a sea of faces, some friendly, some skeptical, some openly curious about what she would say. She could feel the weight of expectations, the sense that this speech would define her tenure before it even began. In the front row, Cordell was beginning to understand something was wrong, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror as he started to put the pieces together. The woman whose hair he'd pulled. The assumption of command ceremony. The VIP seating for his entire squad. The puzzle was assembling itself in his mind, and the picture it formed was not one he wanted to see. Lyra let the silence stretch for a moment, a technique she'd learned from watching great commanders over the years. Let them wait, let them wonder, then deliver your words with precision and purpose. 48 hours ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly across the parade ground, I was sitting in the mess hall observing life on this base, trying to understand the culture I was about to become part of. I was in civilian clothes, trying to be invisible, trying to learn. And while I was sitting there, a Marine pulled my hair and made assumptions about who I was and what I was worth based on nothing more than my gender and appearance. The crowd stirred, a ripple of reaction moving through the assembled personnel. Cordell's face had gone white, his body rigid with the understanding of what was about to happen. His friends looked equally horrified, their eyes darting between Lyra and their sergeant major, who stood behind them with an expression that promised consequences yet to come. That Marine didn't know I'd just returned from a deployment where I'd flown 93 combat missions supporting SEAL operations in Syria. He didn't know I had a Silver Star for pulling wounded operators out of a hot landing zone while taking fire from 3 directions. He didn't know I'd been specifically requested for this command by the SEAL Team 7 commander himself because of my reputation for getting the job done and bringing my people home alive. Lyra's voice remained calm, conversational even, but every word landed like a hammer blow. He didn't know any of that because he didn't bother to find out. He made an assumption based on the fact that I was a woman sitting alone in the mess hall, and he felt entitled to disrespect me because of that assumption. She paused, scanning the crowd, making eye contact with her new detachment members, with the SEAL leadership, with the Marines who were trying to disappear into their uniforms. I'm not telling you this story to embarrass anyone, though I suspect a few people are feeling pretty embarrassed right now. I'm telling you this because it illustrates something important about the culture we need to build in this detachment. We judge people by their actions and their competence, not by their gender or appearance or any other superficial characteristic. When you see someone in uniform, you treat them with the respect their rank and position deserve until their actions prove they don't deserve it. And when you see someone out of uniform, you extend basic human courtesy regardless of who you think they might be. The fog had fully burned off now, leaving the parade ground bathed in morning sunlight that made the ribbons on everyone's chest gleam like tiny jewels. Lyra felt the sun warm on her face, felt the attention of hundreds of people focused on her words, felt the moment crystallize into something that would be remembered and retold for years to come. This detachment has a reputation as one of the finest SEAL support units in the Navy. You've earned that reputation through blood and skill, and the kind of flying that most aviators only dream about. I'm honored to be your new commander, and I promise you this: I will uphold that standard of excellence. I will demand the best from every person under my command, regardless of their background, and I will not tolerate behavior that diminishes anyone serving in this unit or supporting our mission. She turned slightly, looking directly at the row of Marines who were trying to become one with the ground beneath their feet. Corporal Cordell, front and center. Her voice carried the unmistakable tone of command, the sound of an order that wasn't optional. Cordell moved forward as if being pulled by invisible strings, his face ashen, every eye in the assembly tracking his progress across the parade ground. He stopped 3 feet from the podium, standing at rigid attention, probably contemplating all the ways his military career had just taken a catastrophic turn. "Corporal, you and I met 2 days ago in the mess hall. Do you remember what you said to me?" Lyra kept her voice level, conversational, giving no hint of anger or vindictiveness. Just fact-finding, commander to subordinate, in front of several hundred witnesses. "Yes, ma'am." Cordell's voice was barely audible, his throat working as he struggled to maintain composure. "What did you say, Corporal?" Lyra let the question hang in the air, forcing him to voice his actions in front of everyone who mattered. "I pulled your hair, ma'am, and I made disrespectful comments about you." Cordell's voice cracked slightly, the words clearly causing physical pain to speak aloud. "I assumed you were a civilian. I was wrong, ma'am. I'm sorry." Lyra nodded slowly, acknowledging the apology without accepting it. "You were wrong about more than just my status as a civilian, Corporal. You were wrong about the entire premise that gave you permission to touch someone without consent and make derogatory assumptions about their worth. That kind of thinking has no place in today's military, and it especially has no place on this base, where we're trying to build a culture of mutual respect and professional excellence." She paused, watching him process her words, seeing the genuine shame and regret in his face mixing with the fear of professional consequences. "However," Lyra continued, her tone shifting slightly, "I'm not going to end your career over this. You made a mistake, a bad one, and you're going to learn from it. Your battalion commander and I have discussed an appropriate response. You and your friends are going to spend the next 30 days working with this detachment during your off-duty hours. You're going to help our maintainers service helicopters. You're going to learn about what we do and why it matters. And you're going to develop an appreciation for every person who wears the uniform, regardless of what they look like or what their job is." She let that sink in for a moment before delivering the final piece. "And at the end of those 30 days, you're going to write a report on what you learned about respect and assumptions and the importance of treating everyone with basic human dignity. That report will be shared with your chain of command and mine. Do you understand, Corporal?" "Yes, ma'am." Cordell's response was sharp now, the relief in his voice palpable. He'd expected court-martial and career destruction, had probably spent the last 48 hours contemplating civilian job prospects. Instead, he'd been given education and a chance at redemption. It was more than he deserved, and everyone present knew it. "Outstanding. Return to your unit." Lyra dismissed him with a nod, watching as he executed a perfect about-face and marched back to his position, his bearing somehow more professional now than it had been moments before. A teaching moment, delivered with precision and witnessed by everyone who needed to see it. The Marines would remember this. The SEALs would remember it. And most importantly, the men and women of her new detachment would remember that their commander protected them while maintaining a standard of professionalism that elevated everyone involved. The ceremony continued with the formal transfer of authority, Harris symbolically handing her the detachment guidon with its gold fringe and unit insignia. Lyra accepted it, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders like a familiar burden. This was what she'd worked for, trained for, bled for throughout her entire career. The chance to lead warriors in direct support of the most elite combat operators in the world. The opportunity to prove that excellence had no gender, that the sky belonged to anyone skilled enough and brave enough to claim it. The base commander administered the oath, and Lyra repeated the familiar words she'd spoken multiple times throughout her career, each time meaning them more deeply than the last. To support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. To bear true faith and allegiance. To obey the orders of the officers appointed over her and the orders of the President of the United States. Words that connected her to every service member who'd ever worn the uniform, from the Revolutionary War to the present day. An unbroken chain of warriors who'd chosen to serve something larger than themselves. Then it was done. She was officially in command, responsible for 16 aircraft and 48 lives and the mission of providing aviation support to SEAL Team 7 wherever in the world they operated. The crowd applauded, the sound rolling across the parade ground like distant thunder. Lyra stood at attention, the guidon in her hands, her cover precise on her head, the ribbons on her chest catching the sunlight, and felt something inside her click into place. This was where she belonged. This was the moment every challenge and setback and hard-won victory had been leading toward. The reception afterward was the usual mix of handshakes and congratulations and careful assessment. SEALs approached with the cautious respect they accorded any new commander, measuring her with eyes that had seen combat and death and could recognize authenticity from across a room. Lyra met each introduction with firm handshakes and direct eye contact, remembering names and faces with the precision she'd always applied to mission details. These were her customers, the men she would support in combat, whose lives would depend on her ability to deliver aircraft and crews to the right place at the right time under the worst possible conditions. Master Chief Riordan materialized at her elbow with a cup of coffee and a brief situation report. "The detachment's assembled in the hangar, ma'am. Ready for your first all-hands meeting whenever you are." His tone was respectful but familiar, the voice of a senior enlisted advisor who understood his role in the command structure. Riordan would be her eyes and ears among the enlisted personnel, the conduit for information that didn't flow through official channels, the guardian of enlisted culture and morale. Having him on her side was essential. Earning his trust would be an ongoing process. "Give me 5 minutes to finish these conversations, Master Chief, then we'll head over." Lyra took the coffee gratefully, using it as a prop while she navigated the social requirements of the reception. The Marine Battalion commander approached, his expression carefully neutral, clearly torn between annoyance at having his Marines publicly embarrassed and respect for how she'd handled the situation. They exchanged pleasantries and agreed to keep communication channels open, both understanding that this morning's ceremony would become legend, retold and embellished in ready rooms and mess halls for years to come. The walk to the hangar took them past rows of helicopters in various states of readiness. MH-60 Seahawks primarily, the workhorses of Naval Special Operations Aviation, configured for everything from direct action support to personnel recovery. Their gray paint schemes and mission-specific modifications spoke to thousands of hours flown in the world's most dangerous airspace. Lyra felt her pulse quicken slightly at the sight of them, the familiar love of flying rising in her chest like an old friend returning home. This was her world, had always been her world, the place where skill mattered more than politics, and where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. The hangar was massive, easily large enough to hold all 12 of the detachment's assigned aircraft with room left over for maintenance bays and crew spaces. But today, it had been converted into an auditorium of sorts, with chairs arranged in rows facing a small platform. The detachment personnel were already seated, 48 men and women ranging in age from early 20s to mid-40s, representing every specialty required to keep a helicopter aviation unit operating at peak efficiency. Pilots and aircrew in the front rows, maintainers and support personnel behind them, all wearing their working uniforms, all watching her with expressions that ranged from curious to skeptical to cautiously optimistic. Lyra stepped onto the platform without preamble, waving off Riordan's attempt to call the room to attention. "Stay seated, stay comfortable. I'm Captain Kavanagh, and as of approximately 30 minutes ago, I work for you." That got their attention, several heads coming up sharply at the phrasing. "I say I work for you because that's how I view command. My job is to provide you with the resources, training, and support you need to accomplish the mission. Your job is to be the best at what you do, to maintain these aircraft to the highest standards, and to deliver our SEAL customers wherever they need to go under any conditions imaginable." She paused, scanning the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. "I've reviewed all your records. You're good. Some of you are exceptional, but good and exceptional aren't enough when you're supporting the teams. We need to be perfect, every time, because the men we support don't get second chances when things go wrong." The room was silent now, everyone focused on her words with the intensity that came from knowing they were hearing their commander's actual priorities rather than the usual change-of-command platitudes. "I expect 3 things from every person in this detachment. First, technical excellence. Know your job better than anyone else possibly could. Second, professional integrity. If there's a problem, if something's broken or unsafe or not working right, speak up immediately. I will never punish honest reporting of issues. Third, mutual respect. We're a team, and teams function best when every member values every other member's contribution." She shifted her weight slightly, her voice taking on a harder edge. "What I will not tolerate is the kind of behavior I encountered in the mess hall 2 days ago. Disrespect based on gender, race, rank, or anything other than someone's actual performance has no place in this detachment. Clear?" A chorus of "Yes, ma'am" echoed through the hangar, the sound sharp and unified. Lyra nodded approval. "Outstanding. Now let me tell you a little about where I come from so you understand my perspective. I grew up in Montana flying with my father who ran a crop dusting business. I went to Annapolis, got my wings, and deployed to Iraq 3 times and Afghanistan once. I've logged over 2,000 hours in combat zones, flying everything from milk runs to direct action support to combat search and rescue. I've been shot at, shot down, mortared and blown up. I've lost friends and colleagues. I've also learned that flying in support of special operations is the most challenging, rewarding, and important mission in military aviation. She let that settle before continuing. I requested this command specifically because I wanted to lead the best. Team 7 has a reputation that speaks for itself, and you've built that reputation through skill and dedication and the willingness to go anywhere and do anything to support your SEAL teammates. I'm not here to change that culture. I'm here to strengthen it, to make sure we're giving our customers capabilities they can't get anywhere else, and to ensure that every person in this detachment has the opportunity to develop and grow and become the best version of themselves. Another pause, another scan of the room. Questions. A hand went up in the third row. Lyra nodded at the petty officer, a young woman with maintainer insignia on her uniform. "Ma'am, what's your call sign?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity, no hint of challenge. Call signs were important in aviation culture, shorthand identities that often told a story about the pilot's personality or some memorable event from their past. Lyra smiled slightly, a real smile that reached her eyes for the first time that morning. "Valkyrie, given to me in Iraq after I flew a mission that extracted a SEAL element from an ambush. They'd called for emergency exfil, said they had wounded and were about to be overrun. I came in under heavy fire, took multiple hits including one round through the cockpit that missed my co-pilot by about 6 inches, and got them out. The SEAL team leader told me afterward that I'd flown like a Valkyrie, choosing who lived and who died on that battlefield. The memory was vivid even now, 6 years later. The radio calls, the urgency in the voices, the tracers cutting through the Iraqi night, the weight of the helicopter as it struggled to lift off with 12 additional souls aboard. It stuck. Another hand, this one from a pilot in the front row. Lieutenant Junior grade by his insignia, probably fresh from the Fleet Replacement Squadron, and excited to be in his first operational unit. "Ma'am, have you flown with SEAL elements before?" There was no challenge in the question, just the eagerness of someone trying to learn from experience. "Extensively. In Iraq, I was the primary close air support pilot for Team 5 during their Ramadi deployment. In Afghanistan, I worked with multiple teams doing everything from personnel movement to resupply to direct action support. The teams requested me by name for certain missions because they knew I would get them where they needed to go and bring them home again, regardless of conditions." Lyra kept her tone factual rather than boastful. These were just facts, verifiable through her service record, proof of competence that spoke louder than any claim she could make. That relationship is what I want to build here. I want the SEALs to request this detachment specifically because they know we're the best, because they trust us completely, and because we've proven we'll do whatever it takes to support them. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, ranging from technical issues about aircraft maintenance schedules to deployment rotations to training requirements. Lyra answered each one directly and completely, demonstrating a command of details that earned visible respect from her audience. She'd done her homework, had spent countless hours reviewing documentation and records, and it showed in her responses. This wasn't a commander who would rely on subordinates to know the important details. This was someone who understood her business from top to bottom and could discuss any aspect of it with authority. Finally, Riordan stood and called the room to attention, signaling the end of the meeting. Lyra dismissed them back to their duties and remained on the platform as they filed out, watching their body language and listening to their conversations. The mood was cautiously optimistic, the initial skepticism about a female commander giving way to interest in what she might bring to the role. It was a start, not acceptance yet, but an opening, a willingness to give her a chance to prove herself. That was all she'd ever asked for. Commander Vance appeared at her elbow once the hangar had mostly emptied. "Good speech, ma'am. Hit the right notes." His tone was more respectful than it had been in their previous conversation, the product of having witnessed her handle the Cordell situation with skill and restraint. "The pilots want to see you fly before they fully buy in. Standard practice when a new commander arrives." "Understood. Schedule me for a check flight tomorrow. Full mission profile, emergency procedures, the works. I want everyone to see what I can do." Lyra had expected this, had actually been looking forward to it. In the cockpit, she could demonstrate competence in ways that no speech or ceremony could match. "Who's your best instructor pilot?" "Lieutenant Hendricks. Been with the detachment 4 years, has more SEAL support hours than anyone except the Master Chief." Vance pulled out his phone, already scheduling the flight. "I'll set it up for 0600, give you time to go through pre-flight thoroughly. Fair warning, ma'am. Hendricks doesn't go easy on anyone. He'll throw every emergency in the book at you." "Good. I wouldn't want it any other way." Lyra felt anticipation building in her chest, the familiar pre-flight excitement that had never faded despite thousands of hours in the cockpit. Tomorrow she would prove herself in the language she spoke best, the language of stick and rudder and split-second decisions made at altitude. Tomorrow she would show her detachment that their new commander wasn't just a competent administrator, but a pilot who could fly circles around most of them. "Anything else I need to know before I dive into the mountain of paperwork waiting in my office?" Vance hesitated, choosing his words carefully. The men respect the Valkyrie story, but some of them are wondering if it was a one-time thing or if you can still fly at that level. Combat aviation is a young person's game, and you've been on staff tour for the last 18 months. They want to know if you've still got it. It was a fair question, one Lyra had asked herself during the long months of pushing paper and attending meetings while stationed at the Pentagon. Flying was a perishable skill, and time away from the cockpit degraded proficiency in ways that were hard to measure until you were back in the air dealing with emergencies and tight tolerances. "I've been flying civilian helicopters on weekends to stay current. Logged about 50 hours over the past year, plus simulator time. But you're right that there's no substitute for the real thing. Tomorrow we'll answer their questions, one way or another." Vance nodded, seemingly satisfied with her honesty. "One more thing, ma'am. Master Chief Riordan is the best senior enlisted advisor I've ever worked with, but he's fiercely protective of the detachment's culture. He'll support you completely as long as he believes you're making decisions in the best interest of the men. If he starts to doubt that, he'll become an obstacle. Respectfully, but an obstacle nonetheless." "Noted. I appreciate the insight, Commander." Lyra studied her deputy, reassessing him in light of this unsolicited but useful advice. Maybe Vance wasn't as resentful as she'd initially thought. Maybe he was simply a professional officer who wanted his detachment to succeed regardless of who was in command. Time would tell, but this conversation suggested he might become an ally rather than a constant challenge to her authority. "Anything else?" "Just this, welcome to the teams, ma'am. It's the best flying you'll ever do and the hardest. The missions are complex, the expectations are brutal, and the stakes are life and death on a regular basis, but there's nothing else like it in the world." Vance offered his hand, and this time his smile seemed genuine. "I'm glad you're here. We needed someone with real combat experience, and your record speaks for itself. Just prove you can still fly, and the detachment will follow you anywhere." They shook hands, and Lyra felt another piece of her command team click into place. Vance was good at his job, respected by the men, and willing to support her if she earned it. That was more than many new commanders could hope for. "I'll prove it tomorrow, Commander, and then we're going to take this detachment to a level of excellence that makes everyone else jealous. That's not a goal, it's a promise." The rest of the day passed in a blur of administrative requirements and meetings with various stakeholders. The SEAL team commander stopped by her office to welcome her officially and discuss upcoming deployment schedules. The maintenance chief briefed her on aircraft readiness status and parts availability challenges. The operations officer walked her through the current training cycle and qualification requirements. Each conversation added another layer to her understanding of the detachment's capabilities and limitations, filling in details that hadn't been apparent from reading reports and reviewing files. By the time the sun set over the Pacific, Lyra's brain was overloaded with information, and her body was exhausted from the accumulated stress of the day. She'd woken up as a captain about to take command. She'd endured a public ceremony that could have destroyed her before she even started. She'd addressed her detachment and met her leadership team and begun the process of earning the trust and respect that couldn't be commanded, only earned through demonstrated competence and character. And tomorrow, she would climb into a helicopter and prove that she deserved to be called Valkyrie, that the legend was real, and not just a story people told about something that had happened years ago in a different war. She stood at her office window, watching the last light fade from the sky, and thought about the path that had led her here. All the doubters and skeptics and people who'd told her women couldn't fly combat missions. All the instructors who'd graded her harder than her male classmates, forcing her to be better just to be considered equal. All the deployments where she'd had to prove herself over and over, each new unit requiring her to demonstrate competence before they'd trust her with their lives. It had been exhausting and frustrating and occasionally soul-crushing. But it had also made her into someone who didn't know how to quit, who faced challenges with a calm determination that intimidated people accustomed to more emotional responses, who had learned to turn doubt into fuel for excellence. Tomorrow would be another test in a career full of tests, but Lyra had never failed a test that mattered, had never backed down from a challenge that could be overcome through skill and preparation and sheer force of will. She wouldn't start now. The sky was waiting, and with it, the chance to prove once again that competence had no gender, that the wings on her chest had been earned through blood and skill, and the kind of courage that couldn't be faked or awarded as a political gesture. She turned away from the window and began preparing for tomorrow's flight, reviewing emergency procedures and aircraft specifications with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. By the time she finally left the office and headed back to her quarters, she was mentally rehearsing flight profiles and emergency responses, her mind already in the cockpit even though her body was still on the ground. It was a familiar state, this pre-flight focus that shut out everything except the mission, and it felt like coming home after a long absence. Tomorrow she would fly, and in flying she would become Valkyrie once more, choosing who lived and who died with nothing more than skill and nerve and the willingness to push beyond normal limits. Tomorrow the legend would either be confirmed or destroyed. There was no middle ground, no partial credit in combat aviation. You were either good enough or you weren't, and the only way to prove which category you belonged in was to strap yourself into several tons of metal and machinery and challenge the sky to judge you worthy. Lyra fell asleep that night with the familiar anticipation of pre-flight nerves and confidence mixing in her chest, the combination that had preceded every important mission of her career. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing with it challenges and opportunities in equal measure. But tonight, she rested in the knowledge that she'd survived the first day, had handled the Cordell situation with skill and restraint, and had begun the process of earning her place among some of the finest aviators and warriors in the world. The rest would come, one flight at a time, one mission at a time, until the day she could look back and know with certainty that she'd left this detachment better than she'd found it. The alarm sounded at 0430, pulling Lyra from dreams of flying through Iraqi night skis. She dressed in her flight suit with practiced efficiency, the Nomex fabric settling onto her frame like a second skin. Flight suit, boots, survival vest, helmet bag. The uniform of warriors who fought from the sky, unchanged in essentials since her first day as a fleet aviator. She studied herself briefly in the mirror, seeing not the commander or the woman but the pilot, the person who existed most fully at altitude where the only thing that mattered was skill and decision-making under pressure. The flight line was already bustling with activity when she arrived, maintainers conducting pre-flight checks and fueling operations under the harsh glare of sodium lights that turned everything orange and black. Her aircraft for today's check flight was Bureau number 7547, an MH-60S Seahawk with over 3,000 hours on the airframe and a maintenance record that showed meticulous care. Lyra conducted her own walk-around inspection, checking blade track, oil levels, weapons mounts, and dozens of other details that most pilots would have delegated to the crew chief. But she'd learned long ago that your life depended on the condition of your aircraft, and trusting that without verification was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. Lieutenant Hendricks appeared as she was checking the main rotor assembly, his flight suit crisp despite the early hour, his eyes sharp with the kind of awareness that came from flying dangerous missions on a regular basis. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with the lean build of someone who ran marathons and the confident demeanor of a pilot who'd never doubted his place in the cockpit. "Morning, ma'am. I'm your evaluator for today's flight. We'll be doing a full mission profile with simulated emergencies, navigation exercises, and SEAL insertion scenarios. Expected flight time is 3 hours." He offered his hand, his grip firm but not challenging. "Fair warning, I grade hard. My job is to make sure our pilots can handle anything the mission throws at them." "I wouldn't expect anything less, Lieutenant. Let's get after it." Lyra completed her walk-around and climbed into the left seat, the aircraft commander position, settling into the cockpit with the familiarity of someone who'd spent thousands of hours in similar aircraft. Hendricks took the right seat, and their crew chief, a petty officer first class named Martinez, positioned himself at the crew door with the machine gun mount. The startup checklist was second nature, her hands moving across switches and controls with muscle memory that transcended conscious thought. Engine start, systems checks, radio calls to the tower. The twin turbines wound up with their characteristic whine, building power until the entire airframe vibrated with barely contained energy. Lyra brought the rotors online, feeling the aircraft wake up beneath her hands, feeling the subtle feedback through the controls that told her everything was functioning within normal parameters. This was the moment she lived for, the transition from earthbound machine to something capable of flight, the boundary between gravity and freedom. Camp Pendleton Tower, Blackjack 5-4, Flight of 1, ready for departure with information Delta. Request clearance for the SEAL training area. Her radio voice was calm and professional, betraying none of the anticipation thrumming through her veins. The tower cleared them, and Lyra brought the Seahawk into a hover, holding a perfect 3-foot altitude while Hendricks called out systems checks. Satisfied, she transitioned to forward flight, the helicopter accelerating smoothly as they departed the flight line and turned toward the ocean. The California coast fell away beneath them as they climbed to 1,500 feet, the Pacific stretching to the horizon in shades of gray and blue. Lyra flew with smooth, precise inputs, her movements economical and confident, the aircraft responding to her commands as if reading her mind. This was what people who didn't fly would never understand. That at a certain level of skill, the boundary between pilot and machine became blurred, that you stopped flying the helicopter and started thinking it through the air, making adjustments and corrections before conscious thought could process them. Hendricks waited until they reached the training area before starting his evaluation in earnest. "Simulated single-engine failure," he announced calmly, reaching over to pull one of the power controls to flight idle. The helicopter lurched as half its power disappeared, the nose dropping and the rotor RPM sagging toward the bottom of the green arc. Most pilots would have had a moment of panic, would have spent precious seconds diagnosing the problem before responding. Lyra's reaction was instant and instinctive, lowering the collective to maintain rotor RPM while simultaneously pedaling to counter the yaw and pulling the nose up to trade airspeed for altitude. Within 3 seconds, she had the aircraft stabilized in a controlled descent, already identifying a suitable landing zone on the beach below. Continuing single engine, she announced, demonstrating the procedures for flying with only one engine online. The helicopter handled sluggishly without full power, requiring larger control inputs and more altitude management, but she kept it firmly under control, executing turns and altitude changes that proved she could still fly safely to an emergency landing. Hendricks watched her with increasing interest, making notes on his kneeboard but saying nothing. The evaluation continued for the next 2 hours. Simulated electrical failures, hydraulics problems, engine fires, tail rotor malfunctions. Every emergency a military helicopter pilot might face, Hendricks threw them at her in rapid succession, sometimes combining multiple failures to see how she handled cascading problems. Lyra met each challenge with the same calm competence, her voice never rising above conversational tones, even when dealing with scenarios that would have terrified less experienced pilots. This was what years of combat flying had taught her. That panic was a luxury you couldn't afford, that the worst emergencies required the calmest thinking, that your survival depended on maintaining mental clarity even when everything was going wrong. But the technical emergencies were just the warm-up. The real test came when Hendricks directed her to a simulated combat scenario. You're inserting a SEAL element into hostile territory. Known threats include small arms fire and possible man-portable air defense systems. The LZ is hot, you've got wounded to extract, and you're taking fire from multiple positions. Show me what you've got, Captain. Lyra's entire demeanor changed. The professional pilot conducting emergency procedures disappeared, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. She dropped the helicopter toward the deck, accelerating to 140 knots while staying below 100 feet altitude, using terrain masking and speed to minimize exposure to threats. Her scan pattern intensified, eyes constantly moving between instruments, terrain, potential threats, and her crew chief, who was calling out positions on simulated enemy forces. They came screaming into the landing zone at attack speed, Lyra flaring hard at the last second to bleed off velocity, touching down in a cloud of dust and rotor wash with the helicopter oriented for immediate departure. 30 seconds, Martinez called from the back, simulating the time required for SEALs to board. Lyra held the hover despite simulated small arms fire that Hendricks called out over the intercom, her hands steady on the controls, ready to execute emergency departure procedures if the threat level became untenable. The seconds stretched like hours, every instinct screaming to get airborne and out of the kill zone, but she held position until Martinez called clear. Then she pulled maximum power and climbed out aggressively, braking right to throw off enemy aim while maintaining airspeed and altitude awareness. "Christ," Hendricks muttered, barely audible over the intercom. "That was textbook. Where'd you learn to fly like that?" "Iraq, Ramadi. Did it for real about 50 times." Lyra's voice was tight with adrenaline, her body remembering the real thing when the threats weren't simulated and the bullets made actual holes in the aircraft. When people's lives depend on you getting it right, you learn fast or you die. They flew back to base in relative silence, Hendricks absorbed in his evaluation notes while Lyra cooled down from the adrenaline spike of the simulated combat insertion. She'd flown well, she knew that, had demonstrated proficiency that exceeded the minimum standards by a substantial margin. But had it been enough? Had she proven to Hendricks, and by extension, to the entire detachment that she still had the skills that had earned her call sign? The landing back at Pendleton was smooth and precise, Lyra setting the Seahawk down on its spot with barely a bump, the skids kissing concrete with the gentleness of a pilot who'd made thousands of landings and could judge altitude and descent rate to within inches. She completed the shutdown checklist and sat in the cockpit for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her after hours of engine noise and radio chatter. Through the windscreen, she could see a small crowd gathered near the hangar. Word had spread about her check flight, and people had come to see the results. Hendricks removed his helmet and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Captain, I've been an instructor pilot for 5 years. I've evaluated over 200 pilots for mission qualification. That was the best check flight I've ever graded." He extended his hand. "Welcome to the team, Valkyrie. You've still got it." The relief that washed over Lyra was surprising in its intensity. She hadn't realized how much tension she'd been carrying, how much she'd needed this validation. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I appreciate the thorough evaluation." They climbed out of the aircraft, and Lyra found herself immediately surrounded by her detachment's pilots, all of them wanting to hear about the flight from Hendricks, all of them reassessing their new commander in light of what they were hearing. "She flew a single-engine approach that I couldn't have done better," Hendricks was saying to a cluster of junior officers. "And the combat insertion was something else. I've seen plenty of pilots do that maneuver, but she made it look easy, like she'd done it 1,000 times for real." He paused, then added quietly, "She has done it 1,000 times for real. That's the difference. Combat experience changes how you fly." Master Chief Riordan appeared at Lyra's elbow with the inevitable cup of coffee. "Word's spreading fast, ma'am. Hendricks is telling everyone you're the real deal. The men are impressed." There was satisfaction in his voice, the tone of a senior enlisted leader whose commander had just validated his trust. "They're calling you Valkyrie now, not Captain. That's a sign of respect in this community." "Good, because tomorrow we start working on taking this detachment to the next level." Lyra accepted the coffee and turned to face the hangar where more people were gathering, drawn by word of mouth about the new commander's flight performance. "Get the pilots together for a meeting at 1300. I want to start building next month's training schedule, and I have some ideas about how we can improve our insertion and extraction procedures." The meeting that afternoon was markedly different from the previous day's all-hands call. The skepticism was gone, replaced by genuine interest in what their new commander had to say. Lyra laid out her vision for the detachment with the same precision she applied to flying: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound objectives. Increase qualification rates. Reduce maintenance downtime. Improve response times for emergency tasking. Each goal was backed by data and justified by mission requirements. This wasn't pie-in-the-sky leadership rhetoric. This was a combat pilot who understood both the strategic importance of their mission and the tactical details required to execute it successfully. The pilots responded with questions and suggestions, the conversation quickly evolving into a collaborative planning session rather than a top-down briefing. Lyra encouraged the input, recognizing that buy-in came from inclusion, that people supported decisions they helped make. By the end of the 2-hour meeting, they had the skeleton of a training plan that everyone agreed would push the detachment to new levels of capability. It was aggressive, maybe too aggressive, but that was the point. Excellence required stretching beyond comfortable limits. The days that followed established a rhythm: early morning physical training, usually a run or swim with whoever wanted to join. Flight operations throughout the day, either training missions or supporting real-world SEAL exercises. Administrative work in the afternoons, reviewing maintenance reports and personnel evaluations and operational plans. Evenings spent in the ready room with her pilots, building the kind of informal relationships that were essential to unit cohesion. Lyra made a point of being visible, of being available, of demonstrating that she was part of the team rather than separate from it. She also made good on her promise regarding Corporal Cordell and his friends. The Marines showed up every evening for their mandated detachment familiarization, initially sullen and resentful, but gradually becoming interested despite themselves. They worked alongside the maintainers, learning about helicopter systems and the complexity of keeping aircraft mission-ready. They observed flight operations and began to understand the skill required to do what SEAL aviation crews did every day. And they spent time in the classroom learning about the mission, about the history of naval special operations aviation, about the people who died doing this job. By the end of the first week, their attitude had shifted from punishment endured to education received. Lyra made a point of checking on their progress, spending a few minutes each evening talking with them about what they'd learned, subtly guiding their understanding toward the bigger lessons about respect and assumptions, and the importance of seeing people as individuals rather than stereotypes. Cordell in particular seemed to be taking it seriously. His massive frame often found helping the maintainers with heavy lifting, his questions becoming more thoughtful as he learned more about the detachment's capabilities. The teaching moment was working, transforming punishment into genuine growth. The first real test of her command came 3 weeks into her tenure. A SEAL team conducting training exercises off the coast got into trouble, a simulated raid going wrong when actual equipment failures created a real emergency. The radio call came at 0200, Lyra being shaken awake by the duty officer with news that a SEAL element was in the water with failing equipment and deteriorating weather conditions. They needed emergency extraction, and they needed it now. Lyra was dressed and moving before she was fully awake, muscle memory and training taking over where conscious thought was still booting up. She reached the flight line to find her aircraft already being prepared, Martinez and the night crew working with practiced urgency to get the Seahawk mission ready. Commander Vance appeared, also in flight gear, ready to serve as her co-pilot. "Weather's turning bad, ma'am. 20-foot swells, 40-knot winds, zero visibility. This is going to be sporty. Then we'd better get airborne before it gets worse. Is the search and rescue swimmer on board?" Lyra was already conducting her abbreviated pre-flight, trusting the crew chief but verifying anyway because that was what good pilots did. The rescue swimmer, a tough petty officer named Chen, was strapping into the back of the helicopter, his gear checked and double-checked. Within 10 minutes of receiving the call, they were lifting off into darkness and deteriorating weather, vectoring toward the last known position of the SEALs in distress. The flight was everything Vance had promised and worse. The helicopter bucked and shuddered in the violent air, rain hammering against the windscreen with enough force to make visibility nearly impossible. Lyra flew on instruments mostly, trusting her training and experience to keep them oriented, while Vance handled communications and navigation. The darkness was absolute, the kind of black that pressed in from all sides and made you question whether you were right side up or inverted. But she'd flown in worse during combat operations, had learned to trust her instruments even when every sense was screaming contradictory information. "Blackjack 5-4, this is SEAL Team 7 Bravo. We have visual on your position. We're in the water approximately 200 yards off your nose. 4 personnel, 2 injured, equipment failing." The voice on the radio was calm despite the circumstances, the professional tone of someone accustomed to bad situations. "Weather's getting worse. We need extraction now." "Roger Bravo, coming to you." Lyra descended toward the roiling ocean, using her searchlight to cut through the darkness, looking for any sign of the SEALs bobbing in the massive swells, their foreheads visible for a moment before a wave swallowed them. She maneuvered the helicopter overhead, fighting the wind and turbulence, holding position despite conditions that made hovering feel like trying to balance on a greased ball. "Chen, you're up." The rescue swimmer didn't hesitate, dropping into the ocean and immediately disappearing into a trough between waves. Lyra held the hover through pure force of will, her entire focus narrowed to keeping the aircraft positioned correctly despite winds that wanted to push them off station, despite rain that made visibility nearly zero, despite the knowledge that any mistake would put Chen and the SEALs at even greater risk. Seconds stretched like hours as Chen worked below, attaching harnesses and preparing the casualties for extraction. "Ready for pickup," Chen's voice crackled over the radio. Lyra inched the helicopter forward, Martinez operating the rescue hoist with precision that spoke to hundreds of hours of training. One SEAL came up, then another, then the 2 injured. Finally Chen himself, all of them soaked and exhausted but alive and safe inside the helicopter. Lyra climbed out of the hover and turned for home, the worst of the mission complete but the challenge of landing in terrible weather still ahead. They made it back to Pendleton just as the weather reached its peak intensity, Lyra threading the needle between safety minimums and mission necessity. setting the helicopter down on instruments alone because visibility had dropped to nearly zero. When the skids finally touched concrete and she completed the shutdown checklist, Lyra realized her hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline and fatigue combining now that the emergency was over and done. The SEALs were already being treated by corpsmen when Lyra climbed out of the aircraft. Their team leader approached her, his face drawn with exhaustion but his expression grateful. "Captain, that was some of the best flying I've ever seen. You saved our boys tonight. We won't forget it." He offered his hand and Lyra shook it, feeling the weight of responsibility lift slightly. This was what it was all about. Not ceremonies or speeches or politics, but this. Getting people home alive when the stakes were real and the margin for error was zero. "Just doing the job, Master Chief. Glad we got to you in time." Lyra was already reviewing the flight in her mind, cataloging what had gone well and what could be improved, always looking for lessons that might help on the next mission. "Your people showed good discipline out there, made our job easier." Word of the rescue spread through the base faster than the storm that had necessitated it. By morning, everyone knew that the new SEAL aviation commander had flown a dangerous night rescue in conditions that most pilots would have refused, had brought back 4 SEALs including 2 with injuries, had done it all with the kind of skill that made it look routine even though everyone who'd been awake could see the weather and understand exactly how difficult it had been. The legend of Valkyrie was no longer just a story from Iraq. It was real, current, and happening right here at Camp Pendleton under their watch. Lyra found herself facing a different kind of scrutiny after that night. Not skepticism anymore, but something closer to awe mixed with caution. Her people were beginning to understand that their commander wasn't just competent, she was exceptional. And exceptional commanders had a tendency to push their people hard, to demand excellence because they knew it was possible, to set standards that seemed impossible until someone demonstrated they weren't. The detachment's culture was shifting, expectations rising, everyone feeling the weight of living up to a standard that Lyra had embodied through action rather than words. She used that momentum to drive changes she'd been planning since taking command. Extended training hours to improve qualification rates, more realistic exercise scenarios that pushed crews beyond their comfort zones, increased standards for maintenance procedures that reduced aircraft downtime. Each change was justified and necessary, each one making the detachment more capable, but the cumulative effect was exhausting. People were working harder than they had in years, and Lyra knew she was walking a fine line between pushing for excellence and pushing people too far. The breakthrough came 6 weeks into her command during a routine training flight. One of her junior pilots, a lieutenant named Morrison who'd been struggling with confidence issues, was conducting landing practice on the deck of a ship offshore. The approaches were adequate but not excellent, Morrison second-guessing himself and making corrections that were jerky rather than smooth. Lyra, flying as his instructor, had been making notes and offering gentle criticism, but nothing seemed to be clicking. The kid had the technical knowledge, but lacked the confidence to trust his instincts. Finally, after watching Morrison blow another approach, Lyra made a decision. "My aircraft," she announced, taking control. She flew one perfect approach herself, then gave the controls back. "Now stop thinking and just feel it. Trust your hands, trust your training. Stop trying to fly perfectly and just fly." Something in her tone must have resonated because Morrison's next approach was significantly better, and the one after that was excellent. By the end of the training period, he was flying with a confidence that had been absent before, his movements smooth and instinctive rather than mechanical and calculated. When they landed, Morrison pulled off his helmet with an expression that Lyra recognized from her own early career. The look of someone who'd just broken through a barrier that had seemed insurmountable. "Thank you, ma'am. I finally get it. It's not about being perfect, it's about being committed to the decision and making it work." "That's exactly right, Lieutenant." Lyra clapped him on the shoulder, genuinely pleased to see the breakthrough. "You've had the skill all along. You just needed permission to trust it." She watched him walk away with a new confidence in his stride and felt something warm in her chest. This was the other side of command, the part that made all the challenges worthwhile. Not the flying or the missions or the recognition, but this, helping someone discover capabilities they didn't know they had, watching them grow from uncertain to confident, knowing you'd played a role in that transformation. Master Chief Riordan had witnessed the exchange and approached with his characteristic directness. "That's 3 pilots you've brought along in the past month, ma'am. Morrison, Hendricks, and Lieutenant Park. They're all flying better now than before you arrived. The detachment's noticed." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "They're starting to call this place the Valkyrie Academy, half joking but half serious. You're changing the culture, making people better. That's good command." Lyra felt embarrassed pride at the compliment, uncomfortable as always with direct praise but recognizing its value. "I'm just sharing what other instructors taught me, Master Chief, standing on the shoulders of giants." "Maybe, ma'am, but you're doing it in a way that resonates. The men respect you not just for your flying but for how you develop others. That's rare." Riordan's weathered face broke into a smile. "Commander Vance was skeptical about you at first, thought you might be a political appointment. He told me yesterday he was wrong, said you're the best commander he served under. Coming from him, that's high praise." The weeks turned into months, each one bringing new challenges and opportunities. A deployment to Japan for joint exercises with maritime self-defense forces. A complex night raid supporting SEAL Team 7 against a simulated terrorist cell. A personnel crisis when one of her pilots was involved in a domestic incident that required careful handling to protect both the pilot's rights and the detachment's reputation. Each challenge required different skills, different approaches, different aspects of leadership that Lyra drew upon with increasing confidence. She also made time for Cordell and his Marines, who had completed their mandatory familiarization period but kept showing up anyway, drawn by genuine interest in what the aviation detachment did. Cordell in particular had become something of a fixture, his massive frame often seen helping the maintainers or asking questions about helicopter systems. The transformation from the arrogant Marine who'd pulled her hair to a respectful and curious student had been remarkable to witness. On his last required day, he asked to speak with Lyra privately. They met in her office, Cordell standing at attention with an earnestness that was almost painful to watch. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for handling the incident in the mess hall the way you did. You could have ended my career, and you would have been justified. Instead, you taught me something I should have already known." He paused, struggling with emotion. "I learned more from this experience than from any class or training I've received. About respect, about assumptions, about what it really means to serve with honor. I'm a better Marine because of how you handled it." Lyra gestured for him to sit, breaking the formal tone. "Corporal, we all make mistakes. What defines us is whether we learn from them. You took a punishment that could have been just punishment and turned it into genuine education. That took humility and openness to growth. Those are leadership qualities." She leaned back in her chair, studying the young Marine. "What are your career plans?" "I'm up for sergeant soon, ma'am. After that, I don't know. I love being infantry, but this experience opened my eyes to other possibilities." Cordell's expression was thoughtful. "I never knew how complex helicopter operations were, how much skill and teamwork it required. Made me think about whether there are other ways I could serve that I haven't considered." They talked for another 20 minutes, Lyra offering advice based on her own career experiences, encouraging Cordell to think broadly about his future and to remember that growth often came from discomfort. When he finally left her office, she felt a sense of completion. The incident that had threatened to derail her command before it started had become instead a teaching moment that might change a young Marine's entire trajectory. That was leadership at its best, turning problems into opportunities, challenges into growth, conflict into connection. The real validation came 4 months into her tenure when the SEAL Team 7 commander called her into his office for what he described as a routine check-in. Captain Marcus Reeves was a legend in the Special Operations community, a career SEAL with multiple combat deployments, and a reputation for blunt honesty that could be refreshing or intimidating depending on your perspective. He waved Lyra to a chair and studied her with eyes that had seen everything the world had to offer in terms of human behavior, both noble and terrible. Kavanagh, I'm going to be direct because that's how I operate. When I requested you for this command, I took heat from people who thought I was making a political decision rather than an operational one. They said I was prioritizing diversity over capability. Reeves leaned forward, his intensity undimmed by years of service. I told them they were full of shit, that I'd reviewed your record and watched your evaluations and talked to people who'd flown with you in combat. I told them you were the best person for this job regardless of gender, and that anyone who couldn't see that was letting prejudice cloud their judgment. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. 4 months later, your detachment has the highest readiness rates in the West Coast SEAL aviation community. Your pilots are qualifying faster and flying better than anyone else. Your aircraft availability has improved by 15%. And most importantly, my SEALs trust you completely. They know that when they call for air support, Valkyrie is going to show up and make the impossible happen. Reeves allowed himself a small smile. I'm not one for lengthy praise, but I wanted you to know that you've exceeded every expectation I had. You're not just meeting the standard, you're raising it for everyone else. The words hit Lyra with unexpected force, validation from someone whose opinion actually mattered, cutting through months of accumulated stress and self-doubt. Thank you, sir. That means more than you know. She kept her voice steady, professional, but internally she was reeling. This was what she'd been working toward her entire career. Recognition not as a female pilot who'd done well despite her gender, but as a pilot who'd done well, period. The gender was irrelevant. The results spoke for themselves. Don't let it go to your head, Captain. Reeves's tone turned more serious. You've built something good here, but maintaining excellence is harder than achieving it. The challenge now is to sustain this level of performance, to institutionalize the improvements you've made so they outlast your tenure. That's the mark of truly great commanders. They leave their units better than they found them in ways that endure after they're gone. It was a challenge Lyra accepted with the same determination she'd applied to every other aspect of her command. She began documenting procedures and best practices, creating training programs that could be replicated, developing leaders among her subordinates who could carry forward the culture of excellence she'd worked to establish. The detachment had become her legacy in the making, and she was determined that legacy would be measured not by what she'd accomplished, but by what those who came after her would accomplish, building on the foundation she'd laid. The months continued their steady progression, each one bringing new missions and challenges. A real-world search and rescue off the coast of Mexico. Support for counter-narcotics operations involving multiple agencies. Emergency medical evacuation of civilians during a natural disaster. Each mission added to the detachment's reputation, each success building on the last, creating a momentum that carried them forward toward excellence that seemed effortless to outside observers, but which Lyra knew required constant attention and effort to maintain. She also found time for mentorship beyond her immediate command. Young female aviators began reaching out, asking for advice on how to succeed in a career field still dominated by men. Lyra met with each one, sharing hard-won wisdom about proving yourself through results rather than words, about developing thick skin without losing empathy, about finding mentors who cared about your success regardless of your gender. These conversations were important, she realized, not just for the individuals but for the larger project of changing military culture, one interaction at a time. One conversation in particular stayed with her. A young ensign, fresh from flight school and terrified of her first operational assignment, had asked Lyra how she dealt with the constant pressure of being judged more harshly than male counterparts. Lyra had thought carefully before responding, wanting to give honest advice without crushing the young officer's enthusiasm. You acknowledge that the standards are unequal, but you don't let that become an excuse for anything less than your best effort. You fly better than everyone else not because you have to prove a point, but because excellence is its own reward. And eventually, if you're consistent enough for long enough, people stop seeing your gender and start seeing only your capability. It takes time, and it's not fair, but it works. The ensign had left looking thoughtful rather than discouraged, and Lyra hoped she'd struck the right balance between honesty and encouragement. The next generation deserved to know what they were facing, but they also deserved to know it was possible to succeed despite the obstacles. Lyra's career was proof of that, a roadmap showing that competence and determination could overcome bias and skepticism, one flight at a time. The anniversary of her assumption of command arrived with little fanfare. Lyra had been in the role for 12 months, a year of challenges and triumphs and steady progress toward the vision she'd articulated in that first all-hands meeting. The detachment had achieved every goal she'd set, had exceeded performance metrics across the board, had become the standard against which other SEAL aviation units measured themselves. But more importantly, the culture had shifted. Her pilots flew with confidence born from competent leadership and rigorous training. Her maintainers took pride in aircraft that were consistently mission-ready, and the SEALs they supported trusted them completely, knowing that when the situation went bad, SEAL aviation would show up and make miracles happen. Master Chief Riordan organized a small celebration in the hangar, nothing official, just the detachment gathering to mark the milestone and reflect on the year's accomplishments. Lyra was uncomfortable with the attention, preferring action to recognition, but she understood the importance of acknowledging achievements and reinforcing the culture they'd built together. She stood before her people, these warriors and technicians and leaders who'd taken a chance on a commander they'd initially doubted, and felt a profound sense of gratitude and pride. "A year ago," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hangar, "I walked into a mess hall in civilian clothes and encountered assumptions about who I was based on nothing but my appearance. That incident could have defined my tenure here in negative ways. Instead, we turned it into a teaching moment and used it to strengthen our culture. We chose to judge people by their actions rather than their demographics, by their competence rather than their conformity to expectations." She paused, scanning the faces before her, seeing respect and affection and the kind of unit cohesion that couldn't be mandated, only earned. "What we've built together over this past year isn't just a high-performing detachment. It's a proof of concept. Proof that excellence has no gender, no color, no predetermined template. Proof that when you demand the best from people and give them the tools and support to achieve it, they rise to meet those expectations regardless of where they started." The hangar erupted in applause, the sound echoing off the metal walls and filling the space with affirmation. Lyra felt her eyes sting with unexpected emotion, the weight of the year suddenly catching up with her. She'd done it, against skepticism and prejudice, and the accumulated resistance of a culture that hadn't been designed for people like her. She'd built something excellent and enduring. The Valkyrie legacy wasn't just about flying anymore. It was about leadership and mentorship, and proving that the sky belonged to anyone brave enough to claim it. As the celebration continued around her, Lyra slipped outside into the California evening. The flight line stretched before her, helicopters parked in neat rows, ready for whatever mission came next. In the distance, the Pacific Ocean reflected the setting sun in shades of gold and orange, the same ocean she'd crossed countless times to reach combat zones where the flying had been dangerous and the stakes had been life and death. That ocean had tested her, had challenged her to be better than she thought possible, had forged her into someone capable of leading warriors who operated at the edge of human capability. She thought about the path that had led here, from that mess hall incident to tonight's celebration, about Cordell's transformation from antagonist to student, about Morrison's breakthrough from uncertainty to confidence, about the night rescue that had validated her skills and earned her detachment's trust, about the countless small decisions and actions that had accumulated into something larger than their individual components. Excellence wasn't achieved through singular heroic acts. It was built through consistent, disciplined attention to detail, through refusing to accept anything less than the best from yourself and others, through the courage to demand more when everyone else was content with adequate. The door behind her opened and Commander Vance stepped out to join her. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, two aviators watching the sun set over the ocean that defined their profession. Finally, Vance spoke, his voice thoughtful. "You know, ma'am, when you first arrived, I wasn't sure you'd make it. I'd seen too many commanders flame out because they couldn't earn the trust of their people. I was wrong about you. You didn't just earn our trust, you raised our standard of what command could be." "I had a lot of help, Commander. This was never a one-person effort." Lyra's response was genuine, recognizing that her success had been built on the foundation of talented people willing to follow her lead. "You pushed back when I needed it, supported me when I was right, and covered my blind spots when I couldn't see them. That's what good deputies do." They returned to the celebration together, and the evening dissolved into stories and laughter, and the kind of bonding that defined tight-knit military units. Lyra moved through the crowd, talking with her people individually, learning about their lives and families and dreams beyond the uniform. These conversations were important, she'd learned, because people weren't just their job titles and rank insignia. They were complete human beings with complex lives, and great commanders remembered that and cared about all of it, not just the parts that directly affected mission performance. Late in the evening, as people were beginning to filter out, Corporal Cordell appeared at the hangar entrance. He was in civilian clothes, off-duty and clearly uncomfortable about intruding, but determined nonetheless. Master Chief Riordan noticed him first and waved him in, the gesture welcoming rather than questioning. Cordell approached Lyra with something like reverence, his massive frame somehow seeming smaller in this context. "Ma'am, I hope it's okay that I came by. I heard it was the anniversary of your taking command, and I wanted to thank you again." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I wrote the report you asked for about what I learned. I know the 30 days ended months ago, but I kept working on it because I wanted to get it right. I wanted it to actually mean something rather than just being words on paper to satisfy a requirement." Lyra accepted the envelope, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Corporal. I'll read it carefully." She studied him for a moment, seeing not the arrogant Marine from the mess hall but a young man who'd grown through adversity into someone better. "What happened to the promotion to sergeant?" "Made it, ma'am, and I've put in a package to apply for warrant officer training. Figure if I'm going to be a leader, I want to be the kind of leader you are, the kind who makes people better." Cordell's expression was earnest, his transformation complete. "I tell everyone who will listen about what happened, about how you handled it. Some people think I'm crazy for being grateful about getting punished, but they don't understand. You gave me a chance to become someone better when you could have just destroyed me. That's the kind of leadership I want to emulate." After he left, Lyra opened the envelope and read the report. It was thoughtful and honest, acknowledging not just what had happened but the deeper lessons about respect and assumptions, and the importance of seeing people as individuals rather than stereotypes. Cordell's writing was surprisingly eloquent, his insights genuine rather than performative. The teaching moment had worked better than she'd hoped, creating ripples that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances. The months continued their steady progression. New challenges, new missions, new opportunities to demonstrate excellence and push the boundaries of what the detachment could accomplish. Lyra's reputation spread beyond SEAL Team 7, her name becoming synonymous with exceptional aviation leadership. Other commands began requesting her advice on training programs and cultural improvement initiatives. She became a speaker at professional development conferences, sharing lessons learned with other commanders who wanted to replicate her success. The Valkyrie legend had evolved from a story about a single combat mission to a narrative about transformative leadership and the power of high expectations combined with genuine support. But Lyra remained grounded, focused on the mission and the people rather than the recognition. She flew regularly, maintaining her proficiency and staying connected to the operational reality of what her detachment did. She mentored aggressively, developing the next generation of leaders who would carry forward the culture she'd helped build. And she continued to push for excellence, never satisfied with adequate when exceptional was possible, never content to rest on past achievements when future challenges loomed. The sky above Camp Pendleton stretched endless and blue, the Pacific wind carrying the salt smell of the ocean, and the distant sound of helicopters conducting training operations. Lyra stood on the flight line, watching her pilots fly the mission profiles she developed, seeing the fruits of a year's worth of focused effort and dedicated leadership. The aircraft moving through the sky were extensions of the crews flying them, metal and machine transformed into something more by the skill and courage of the people in the cockpits. And those people, every one of them, were better now than they'd been a year ago. Better pilots, better leaders, better versions of themselves. That was the real measure of her command, the true legacy of Valkyrie. Not the awards or the recognition or the legendary stories, but this: people becoming excellent because someone had demanded it of them while giving them the tools and support to achieve it. The sky belonged to anyone brave enough to claim it. She'd proven that throughout her career. But more than that, excellence belonged to anyone willing to work for it, regardless of where they started or what obstacles they faced. That was the lesson, the one that mattered most. And as Lyra watched her detachment fly perfect formations against the California sky, she knew that lesson would endure long after she'd moved on to whatever challenge came next. The Valkyrie legacy was secure, not in her actions but in theirs, not in what she'd accomplished but in what she'd enabled others to accomplish. That was leadership at its finest. That was the point of it all.